You go through life and there are a lot of variations in the investment opportunities. So when I started in 1970, 10 years, US government bonds were yielding, say, around 6%. And then we had a period of accelerating inflation. And during this period of accelerating inflation, we had the outperformance of energy stocks and mining stocks, with the result that by 1980-81, the energy sector made up for something like 35% of the S&P 500 in the US. So we have this first 10 years, high inflation, accelerating inflation, and also period of rapid interest rate increases, whereby interest rates already in 1969, when inflation was about the same as it's been now in 2022, but at that time, the 10 years reached already over 9% yield. And then we dropped into 1974 and into 1973, and then we rose again sharply until 74, when the yield on the 10 years was 12%, but inflation wasn't any higher than it's been recently. In other words, we have waves of inflation, rising inflation, then it cools down, and then it takes off again. And it would be wrong to assume that bulk of the existing inflation we have now in the system is already over. It could be under some conditions, but it could also be just a temporary relief before inflation accelerates again. It's a monetary phenomenon, and it has to do with fiscal deficit. You will not get inflation when you have a balanced budget. In other words, when the government every year collects the tax it needs to expend. You would also have no wars if people had to pay for the wars. The government borrows money, so the public doesn't really see it. Inflation is a tax. It is a very vicious tax because it hits some classes of society much harder than other classes of societies. In the 80s, we had the rules of the investment game changing. In 1970, gold was $35 an ounce. The peak in 1980 was $850. Silver went from something like $2 to $50 in a short squeeze. And I was there involved in this wave of speculation. Our office in Hong Kong, we had a visitors gallery where the speculators would come in at night with the nightclub hostesses and trade gold and silver. And then the rules of the game changed. After 1980, we had a period of disinflation. In other words, we didn't have deflation with prices coming down, but the rate of inflation slowed down. And we entered a period of essentially 40 years during which interest rates and inflation came down. And in the US, they bottomed out in May 2020. After that, we are now again, in my view, in a period of rising inflation and rising interest rates. But these are long cycles. And then the other major feature of the 1980s was the financialization of the world. In other words, financial markets became much bigger than the economy, expanding and expanding because of money printing. And a further very important feature was that when I went to Hong Kong in 73, we were eager to get rich people in Asia to invest in the US and to buy US bonds and to develop business with financial institutions. My first client in Australia was Commonwealth Mining. They had a beautiful building in Sydney on Harbour, and Friedman was running it. And we became friends, and then I witnessed the rise of BT Australia. Chris Corrigan is a good friend, and Olive Brown, and so forth. So I know Australia very well, and then I discovered that many wealthy Australians wanted to have money outside Australia for tax reasons, and so I developed the private business also. But in the early 80s, it occurred to me that many emerging markets in Asia, Philippines and Hong Kong also, because we had a slump in the real estate market after 1980, and Singapore and Thailand and so forth, and also Taiwan, South Korea, they were very cheap compared to Japanese stocks. So I tried to get American institutions and European institutions to invest in Asia, which was partially successful. By 86, I noticed that Asia was expensive, but because I had read a very important book, The Economics of Inflation, I discovered that Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, and also Colombia were very inexpensive, these markets. I traveled to Argentina. The whole stock market was worth $500 million. And then I started to invest in Argentina and in Chile and in Brazil. And so what I want to say is that when you're born and when you start to work work, there is one sector of the world that will do well. When I started to work, Japan was rising and the stock market rose until 89. But after that, it went to sleep or in bear market. But more recently, after 1990, Chinese stocks became kind of the hot commodity. And then they went ballistic. And the Nasdaq, of course, until the year 2000. And now in the last few years, the Bang and Bang-related stock, the Magnificent Seven. So each period has a different characteristic. And this, I think, is a very fascinating feature of being involved in financial markets, because it's never the same. If you are, say, a carpenter, you can use your technology or your knowledge more or less the same way for ages. But in financial markets, everything changes rapidly all the time, and you have to focus on different sectors from time to time. And this keeps you essentially always on your guard. Some people are less fascinated, but I'm fascinated by price movement. The price of gold goes up, or the price of cocoa. It's interesting, in the 70s, the first commodities to peak out were wheat, corn, soybeans in 1973. And then in 77, there was a huge boom in cocoa and in coffee. They collapsed, and then the precious metals and oil continued to go up until 1980. So even in an inflationary time, you can have assets that go down. That many people don't understand, because inflation doesn't lift all prices equally. It lifts here, then here, and so forth. I mean, it's been a very interesting time and fascinating time, and I've seen the whole world because I traveled to all these emerging economies. So we are experts at making the same mistakes. But I think we have to distinguish what is the objective. The investor has to ask himself, the most important question in life from a philosophical point of view is who I am. How do I behave? I'm impulsive, I'm passionate, or I'm more balanced, and I am willing to take risks. Some people are risk averse. I mean, I've seen it with my clients. You could explain to someone a situation that looked attractive and he wouldn't do it. Nowadays, you look at the CEOs, they're all vokes. They go with the stream. They support socialists like the BLM movement and so forth. They're crazy. They're crazy. They have no personality. They're afraid to lose their job. That is something in life you should never be afraid of, to lose your job, because one door closes, another one opens up. The point is, I have some investments and some trades of taking risks, whereby we then need to later on discuss the risk taking. And then I'm very conscious about, at my age, it would be difficult for me to do a manual job like being a waiter or a construction worker, because physically you're not as fit as when you're 30 years old or 25. And so I have some investments that I perceive to be relatively safe. But this is my perception. Maybe someone else would say, look, Mark, you have properties in Vietnam, they're not safe. But then I could turn around and say, well, I have properties in Switzerland and in Germany, and they're not safe either, because the government can take it away from you, or they can tax it away from you. We've done that all the time throughout history. So when I grew up in the 50s, it was safe to put money in a bank on deposit. My grandparents always said, Mark, you have to earn money, and 10% of your income you have to save in a bank. Put the money in a bank. My grandparents, they owned some shares in air cables because they were pioneers, winter sport industry. They had built a hotel in the mountains. But what was safe then, to have money on deposit in a bank, is nowadays no longer safe. We've had so many examples. In Cyprus, the deposits were all declared worthless, except some insiders. And the deposit was then paid back $100,000 each, irrespective whether you had $20 million or $200,000. So nothing is safe. Gold, in principle, should be safe, but the government can take it away. And I'm especially afraid of the bureaucracies we have today, because they can do anything and nobody ever gets punished. They get rewarded. Just look at who is the president of the EU. Ursula von der Leyen, someone who is completely incompetent, was shot upstairs. Similar for Habeck, similar for Baerbock. All these characters, they are incompetent to the extreme, but because they were inconvenient through their incompetence, they were shot upstairs. This is the difference between the private sector and the government. In general, in the private sectors, and certainly in China, capable people come to the top, but in government, the most incompetent people climb. My view would be that we will have continuous tendency to the left. Governments, they have to justify their existence by interventions. I believe the best government is the one that does the least. In other words, it reduces regulation and reduces the number of laws. And there are some disadvantages involved with that, but the advantage is the economy becomes freer. Just consider it. There are some countries where someone can just open a small restaurant and he just has to get the license and that's it. The restaurant may not have the toilets of the standard of Australia and of Europe and no special toilets for people in wheelchairs and so forth. But at the same time, the guy who has the initiative to open the restaurant, he can do it. Now, I've seen that with friends of mine who opened, my wife had a restaurant in Hong Kong, a Thai restaurant, because she's Thai. I've seen it, the regulation is such that there is this office of the government that will come and check the sanitary installations, and the police of the firemen comes and checks this, and the people of hygiene come and checks that, and so forth. In Western countries and in America, it's very difficult to open a restaurant for a normal person, because I want to explain that this regulation is actually encouraged by big corporations. Starbucks, as an example, they open a new store. They have their own engineer. He comes, he knows exactly what the regulation is. And then they have their own lawyer. He knows exactly what the legal situation is in Australia. And then they have their accountant and their all kinds of experts. You understand? They, first of all, they know the government officials already. They know to which office to go. And they also know who to bribe. This is very important in life, because the beauty of socialism, if there is any beauty, is that the socialists can easily be bribed. They do anything for money. Someone who is in the private sector knows that essentially corruption is not particularly desirable in an economic system. So he's sort of trying to do his best or compete based on his ability to manage a business and on innovation and on efficiency. This is different with the socialist. He doesn't think that way. He thinks everybody should be the same, so nobody works. So this is a very important point. The more regulation you have, the less dynamic the system becomes. In this respect, I just want to tell you, I was born in 46, and already in the mid-50s, my mother took us children, my brother and me, to Yugoslavia. This was a communist country at the time, run by Tito. I have a picture of him up here. So anyway, I saw as a child already how low the standards of living was in Yugoslavia. At that time, it was still one country. And later on, when I was ski racing, I went frequently to Eastern Europe, and I saw how low the standards of living of people in Eastern Europe was. I mean, you could cross the border and see it with own eyes, how depressed people were and in what kind of a poverty they live compared to the Western world. And you can see it yourself in statistics. How many Westerners were fleeing to Eastern Europe? None. How many Eastern Europe were fleeing to the West, notably? How many Germans from Eastern Europe fled to Western Germany? Countless people. Anyway, the moment these economies rushed, and that the first time I went to Russia was in 1980, but then they opened up after the Berlin Wall fell. Then Russia, there was a boom. First a depression for 2 years, and then a boom, and we had one of the first Russian funds, my partners and I, the Firebird Fund, which did very well in the 1990s. And then China opened up in 1978, and the first 10 years were difficult. I mean, the exports went up and cities developed, mostly in Pearl River Delta. But when the whole country grew very rapidly in the 1990s and after 2000. So the one thing I can say to be optimistic, when I look at poor countries and the countries adopted the capitalistic system, everybody became wealthier and everybody increased his position in society and his standard of living. It's always in a free society, capable people move out more rapidly than incapable people. But everybody's standards of living is lifted by the capable people. And this is something that has encouraged me in the world, say, to see how poor people became not rich in per capita income like the typical Australian, typical Swiss or American, but compared to what they were before, their lives have improved dramatically. And what do the Western governments do against leaders who have brought up their societies to a high standard of living? A good example is Lee Kuan Yew. The Americans bitched all the time about him because he was kind of a benevolent dictator, but Singapore was relatively free and he lifted the standards of living. It's one of the richest cities in the world. They also hate, but can't say it, they hate the Sultan of Dubai because it's not a democracy. It's the proof that a dictator, a ruler, a monarch can bring up a country to extreme success alone without this democratic nonsense.
Interesting. No, the rise of both those countries.
Modi in India, he did in 8 years, now 7.5 years more than the whole Gandhi clan before him. But the Gandhi clan bought American politicians, so they all applauded. But Modi has his own personality. And then a British foreign minister who became prime minister later, Liz Truss, went to India to teach the Indians what to do and how to behave. India has now overtaken Britain in terms of size of the economy. And do you think British can go to China and start an opium war nowadays? It's laughable. It's laughable. China has 28% of global industrial production, much bigger than the US. They produce as much cement as the rest of the world combined. If I were Australia, I would be friendly with China and not with the US.